Hello, good day. For today, our topic is understanding and classifying costs. In this video, I will discuss the meaning of costs, and after that, I will classify the cost into different categories. Okay, let's start. In order for us to understand what cost is all about, we must first define it. Cost is actually the monetary amount of the resources given up or sacrificed to attain some objective. That means if your objective is to acquire goods or enjoy services, you need to give up or sacrifice some of your resources. And the monetary value or the monetary measure of the amount of resources na ginive up mo or sinacrifice mo, yan yung tinatawag na cost. So here, the definition of cost is a general definition of cost. When notified by a term that defines the purpose, cost becomes operational. What does it mean by this statement? Ang ibig sabihin niyan, yung term na cost is a general term. At pwedeng mabago yung term na cost depende sa purpose. For example, if your purpose is to acquire goods or acquire property, meron kang gagastusin at ang tawag doon sa gagastusin mo ay cost. In general, ang tawag ay cost, but specifically, ang tawag ay acquisition cost. Paano naman kung ang purpose mo is to produce a product or manufacture a product? Ang tawag doon sa gagastusin mo ay cost in general. Pero, specifically, ang tawag ay manufacturing cost. Sa pag-manufacture ng product, meron kang direct materials, meron kang direct labor, at meron kang factory overhead. In general, ang tawag doon ay cost. Pero specifically, ang tawag doon ay production cost or manufacturing cost. So that is the meaning of the second statement. When modified by a term that defines the purpose, cost becomes operational. Next, let's proceed to the classification of costs. The classification of costs is divided into four. First, the classification of costs according to function. Second, the classification of cost according to traceability. Third, the classification of cost according to decision making, or sometimes tinatawag to as classification of cost for decision making. And fourth, the classification of cost according to behavior. So ang gagawin natin dyan, iisa-isahin natin siyang i-explain. The first classification of cost is the classification of cost according to function. Under this, we have two. The first one is called as product cost, and the second one is called as period cost. Let's differentiate product cost from period cost. Unahin nating i-explain yung product cost. The product costs are those incurred to produce a product. From the name itself pa lang, masasabi mo na yung product cost ay yung cost na na-incur sa pag-manufacture ng product. And since ito yung cost na na-incur sa pag-manufacture ng product, ang product cost tinatawag din siya as manufacturing costs. We have three product costs or manufacturing costs, and they are first, direct materials, second, direct labor, and third, factory overhead, or otherwise known as manufacturing overhead. For additional information, the sum of direct materials and direct labor are called as prime costs, and the sum of direct labor and factory overhead are called as conversion costs. Ang tanong, bakit tinawag na prime cost yung sum ng direct materials at direct labor? Tinawag sila as prime costs kasi nga ito yung mga pangunahing kailangan para makapag-manufacture ng product. Kailangan talaga natin ng direct materials at direct labor. Bakit tinawag na conversion cost yung sum ng direct labor at factory overhead? Kasi nga, ang direct labor at factory overhead, ito yung mga kailangan para ma-convert yung materials into finished products or finished goods. Remember, we have three manufacturing costs. They are direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. Pag pinagsama mo yung direct materials at direct labor, ang tawag doon, prime cost. Pag pinagsama mo yung direct labor at factory overhead, ang tawag doon ay conversion cost. Another question is, how do we treat the product costs? The answer is, it depends whether the related units are still unsold or sold. That means, yung treatment ng product cost, depende yan kung nabenta na or hindi pa nabenta yung related units or products. Kapag yung related units ay unsold, hindi pa siya nabibenta, they are inventoriable and deferred as assets. Anong ibig sabihin yan? That means, yung cost ay magre-remain sa ending inventory. The costs will remain in ending inventory if the related units are still unsold. Since sinabi dito na inventoriable kapag unsold pa lang yung related units, sometimes tinatawag din ang product cost as inventoriable cost. Kapag nabenta na yung related units or sold na, the cost of inventory is transferred from the asset classification to cost of goods sold classification as an expense. That means yung cost, matatransfer na siya sa cost of goods sold kasi nga nabenta na yung related units or related products. As a summary, if the related units are still unsold, the cost will remain in ending inventory. If the units are sold, the cost is transferred to the cost of goods sold classification as an expense. Next, pag-usapan naman natin yung period costs after discussing the product cost. The period costs are those incurred outside of the production activities. Costs incurred outside of the production activities. Meaning to say, lahat ng costs na hindi na-incur sa pag-transform ng materials sa finished goods, tinatawag na period costs. Ang tanong, bakit tinawag na period costs yung mga costs na na-incurred outside ng production? Kasi nga, these costs are expensed once incurred, or they are expensed as incurred. Since itong period costs ay yung mga na-incur outside sa production, tinatawag din na non-manufacturing costs ang period costs. Examples of period costs or non-manufacturing costs are: first, research and development; second, marketing costs; third, distribution costs; fourth, selling costs; and fifth, after-sales costs. Kung titignan natin yung mga examples, masasabi natin na lahat ng mga yan ay costs na hindi na-incur sa production or hindi na-incur sa pag-manufacture ng product. Let us now proceed to the next classification of cost, and that is the classification of cost according to traceability. Under this, we have two costs, and they are the direct costs and the indirect costs. Let us now distinguish direct costs from indirect costs. Direct costs are costs that are related to a particular cost object and can directly be traced or identified to that cost object. Para maintindihan nyo kung ano bang ibig sabihin ng direct cost, kailangan nyo munang alamin kung ano bang ibig sabihin ng cost object. Ang cost object, this is basically anything for which cost is computed. For example, kino-compute mo yung cost ng product. Then, the product itself is the cost object. Kasi kino-compute mo yung cost ng product. So here, the product is a very good example of a cost object. Meron pa tayong ibang examples ng cost object. Okay, we have product line, we have segment of an organization. In this video, para ma-explain ko ng mabuti kung ano bang ibig sabihin ng direct cost at indirect cost, ang gagamitin nating cost object ay product. So, balik tayo dun sa meaning ng direct cost. Direct cost are costs that are related to a particular cost object and can directly be traced or identified to that cost object. Ang cost object natin dito ay product. So, kung yung cost ay directly na matitrace mo or directly na ma-identify mo dun sa mismong product, yan ang tinatawag na direct cost. For example, the cost object is a furniture. Yung cost ng wood ay direct cost. Kasi nga, yung wood, directly nating matitrace or ma-identify dun sa furniture. Another example is yung cost of labor or yung sahod. Sabihin na natin sahod nung mismong gumawa ng furniture. That is also a direct cost. Kasi directly nating matitrace or ma-identify dun sa furniture mismo. That is the meaning of direct cost. On the other hand, indirect costs are costs that are related to a cost object but cannot directly be traced to a cost object. This is the opposite of direct cost kasi nga although related siya dun sa cost object natin, yun nga lang, hindi siya directly traced or identified to the cost object. Pag-aralan natin yung product costs. Ang product costs, meron siyang tatlo. We have three product costs. They are direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. Yung direct cost natin dyan ay yung direct material at direct labor. Yung factory overhead, ang included kasi dito ay yung mga indirect materials at indirect labor. Therefore, the factory overhead is the indirect cost. Let us now proceed to the next classification of cost, and that is the classification of cost according to decision-making or for decision-making. Under this, we have four, and they are first, relevant costs, second, differential costs, third, opportunity costs, and fourth, sunk or past or historical costs. Relevant costs are future costs that will differ under alternative courses of action. Dito, sa definition ng relevant costs, masasabi natin na merong dalawang attributes or characteristics ang relevant costs. Unang-una, dapat ito ay differential cost at pangalawa, dapat ito ay future costs. Kapag sinabing differential, ang ibig sabihin nun, they differ from one alternative to another. At pag sinabing future, ang ibig sabihin nun, they deal about the future. Para masabi na yung cost ay isang relevant cost, dapat hindi lang siya future, dapat differential din. Dapat hindi lang siya differential, dapat future din. So, in order to classify a cost as relevant cost, dapat dalawa ang kanyang characteristics. Unang-una, differential at pangalawa ay future. I will give you an example of a relevant cost. For example, magde-decide ka kung ikaw ay mag-rent or magko-construct ng building. Yung rental expense ay relevant. Why? Unang-una, yung rental expense varies from both alternatives. Ang ibig sabihin nun, magkakaroon ka lang ng rental expense kung ikaw ay nag-rent or kung ikaw ay mag-rent. Pero hindi ka magkakaroon ng rental expense kung ikaw ay magko-construct ng building. It varies from both alternatives. At pangalawa, dahil magde-decide ka pa lang whether to rent or to construct a building, that means the rental expense is a future cost. So here, sa example ko, yung rental expense is both differential and future. Kaya yung rental expense ay relevant cost. Pero, yung salary ng manager ay hindi pwedeng i-consider or i-classify as relevant cost. Why? Kasi yung salary ng manager, regardless kung ang pipiliin niya ay mag-rent or mag-construct ng building, constant pa rin yung salary ng manager. Yung salary ng manager ay expected na magiging constant or mag-remain the same. Hindi siya magbabago. It doesn't differ from one alternative to another. Kaya yung salary ng manager ay irrelevant. Therefore, it is not considered as a relevant cost. So always remember that in order for you to classify cost as a relevant cost, dapat differential at future. Punta naman tayo dun sa differential cost. Differential costs are the difference in costs between any two alternative courses of action. That means, i-compare mo yung dalawang alternative courses of action at yung difference nila, yan yung tinatawag na differential costs. Meron tayong dalawang klase ng differential costs. We have incremental cost and decremental costs. Ang ibig sabihin ng incremental, increasing. Decremental, decreasing. Therefore, pag sinabing incremental cost, it is the increase in cost from one alternative to another. At pag sinabi namang decremental cost, this is the decrease in cost from one alternative to another. Pangatlo, we have opportunity cost. The opportunity cost, ang ibig sabihin niyan, this is the income or benefit given up when one alternative is selected over another. There are at least two alternative courses of action, or there are at least two options. Pag pinili mo yung isang option over another, yung benefit na masasacrifice mo for not choosing that option ay tinatawag na opportunity cost. Meron at meron kang i-give up or isa-sacrifice kasi hindi mo pinili yung isang option. Let's say a company is evaluating whether to sell product A and earn 100,000 pesos or sell product B and earn 120,000 pesos. Kung yung company nag-decide na ibenta yung product A, ang opportunity cost ay yung 120,000 pesos na hindi ma-earn ng company kasi nga hindi niya pinili na ibenta yung product B. Yun yung ibig sabihin ng opportunity cost. Kung yung company naman nag-decide na ibenta yung product B, that means hindi niya piniling ibenta yung product A, that means the opportunity cost is the 100,000 pesos na hindi ma-earn ng company kasi nga hindi niya piniling ibenta yung product A. That is the opportunity cost. Again, the opportunity cost is the income or benefit given up when one alternative is selected over another. The fourth cost is the sunk or past or historical costs. These costs are already incurred and cannot be changed by any decision made now or to be made in the future. In other words, kapag sinabing sunk costs, ito yung cost na na-incurred na in the past at hindi na pwedeng palitan. They are constant and not differential. Since historical siya or past, and at the same time not differential, ang sunk cost hindi siya pwedeng i-consider as relevant cost. Kasi nga, it violates the two attributes or characteristics of relevant cost na dapat future and at the same time differential. A very good example of a sunk cost is depreciation expense. Kasi ang depreciation expense na incur na ito and it relates to the past. Again, we have four costs under the classification of costs according to decision making. They are the relevant costs, differential costs, opportunity costs, and sunk or past or historical costs. Let us now proceed to the last classification of cost, and that is the classification of cost according to behavior. Ang ibig sabihin ng behavior, yan yung reaction ng cost sa changes ng cost driver. Yan yung reaction ng cost kapag nag-change ang cost driver. Anong ibig sabihin ng cost driver? At this point, it is very important for you to know what cost driver is all about. A cost driver is any variable such as a level of activity or volume that usually affects costs over a period of time. Examples of cost driver are production, sales, and number of hours. So dito sa classification of cost according to behavior, pag-aaralan natin yung reaction ng different cost kapag nagbago ang cost driver. Under this classification of cost according to behavior or reaction to changes in cost driver, we have three costs. Unang-una, ang tawag doon ay variable cost. Pangalawa, ang tawag doon sa cost ay fixed cost. At yung pangatlong classification ay mixed cost. Kapag sinabing variable cost, the total amount varies directly to the change in activity level or cost driver, and the per unit amount is constant. Para mas madali nyo siyang maintindihan, let us tabulate. Dito yung variable cost, dito yung total amount, at dito yung per cost driver. Kapag ang pinag-uusapan ay total variable cost, this cost varies directly with the cost driver. Ang ibig sabihin niyan is kung tumaas yung cost driver, tataas din yung total variable cost. Kung magdi-decrease yung cost driver, magdi-decrease din yung total variable cost. Kasi ang sabi, varies directly with the cost driver. Kung ang pinag-uusapan naman is variable cost per cost driver, let's say for example, variable cost per unit. Regardless kung tataas yung cost driver or bababa, kung ano man ang kanyang changes, constant pa rin ang variable cost per cost driver. Punta naman tayo sa fixed cost. Ang ibig sabihin ng fixed cost, the total amount remains unchanged and the per unit amount varies inversely or indirectly with the change in the cost driver. Para mas madali nyo siyang maintindihan, let us tabulate. Kung ang pinag-uusapan is total fixed cost, regardless of the change in the cost driver, constant ang total fixed cost. Pero kung ang pinag-uusapan ay fixed cost per cost driver, let's say fixed cost per unit, it varies inversely with the cost driver. Meaning to say, kung tataas yung cost driver, yung fixed cost per cost driver ay bababa. Vice versa, kung yung cost driver ay bumaba, that means yung fixed cost per cost driver ay tataas. Kasi ang sabi, varies inversely with the cost driver. At yung pangatlong cost ay tinatawag na mixed cost. Bakit siya tinawag na mixed cost? Kasi nga, yung cost na ito ay may variable at fixed components. This cost has both variable and fixed components. Mixed cost is otherwise known as semi-variable costs. Para mas lalo nyong maintindihan yung behavior ng variable costs, fixed costs, at mixed costs, here is the summary of the cost behavior patterns. Gagawa tayo ng dalawang columns. The first column is for the cost classification, and the second column, that is for the activity level or cost driver. Hahatiin pa natin yung column sa activity level or cost driver. Yung first column, that is for the increase in activity level or cost driver. And the second column, that is for the decrease in activity level or cost driver. Of course, under the cost classification, meron tayong tatlong costs. Yung una, variable costs. Yung pangalawa, fixed costs, at yung pangatlo, mixed costs. Of course, yung variable costs, nahati yan sa dalawa. We have variable costs per total and we have variable costs per unit. Please do not be confused. Yung variable costs per total, pareho lang yan sa total variable costs. At yung variable cost per unit, pareho lang yan sa variable cost per activity level or cost driver. Ang ginamit kong term dito ay unit kasi usually sa problem, ang ginagamit na activity driver or activity level or cost driver ay number of units. Ganon din sa fixed cost. We also have fixed cost per total and we also have fixed cost per unit. Ganon din sa mixed cost. We also have mixed cost per total and we also have mixed costs per unit. Unahin kong i-discuss yung behavior ng variable cost per total. Kapag nag-increase yung activity level or cost driver, yung variable cost per total ay mag-i-increase din. At kung magdi-decrease yung activity level or cost driver, magdi-decrease din yung variable cost per total. Yan yung sinasabi natin na directly related. Kasi kung anong nangyari, kung ano yung change dun sa activity level or cost driver, ganun din yung change sa variable cost per total. So, ang relationship ng variable cost per total dun sa activity level or cost driver ay direct relationship. Buti pa, ang variable cost per total at activity level or cost driver may direct relationship. Samantalang yung iba, walang relationship. Kaya para mas matandaan mo, isipin mo na lang yung variable cost per total at yung activity level or cost driver magjowa. Kasi kung ano yung pinuntahan ng isa, yun din yung pupuntahan ng pangalawa. At isipin mo na lang na meron silang relationship at yung relationship nila ay hindi long-distance relationship. Next, yung variable cost per unit naman. Kung nag-increase yung activity level or cost driver, yung variable cost per unit ay constant. Kung nag-decrease yung activity level or cost driver, yung variable cost per unit ay constant. Hindi siya nagbabago. Sana all hindi nagbabago. How about the fixed costs? Kung nag-increase yung activity level or cost driver, constant ang fixed cost per total. At kung nag-decrease yung activity level or cost driver, constant pa rin ang fixed cost per total. Isipin mo na lang magjowa si variable cost per unit at fixed cost per total kasi pareho silang constant. Sana all talaga constant. Hindi nagbabago. How about the fixed cost per unit? Kung nag-increase yung activity level or cost driver, yung fixed cost per unit ay magdi-decrease. At kung nag-decrease yung activity level or cost driver, tataas ang fixed cost per unit. Isipin mo na lang, merong relationship si fixed cost per unit at activity level or cost driver. Yun nga lang, ang kanilang relationship ay long-distance relationship. Kasi yung isa pataas, yung isa pababa. Yung isa pa ganon, yung isa pa ganon. Ang tawag dyan sa relationship ng fixed cost per unit at activity level or cost driver ay inverse relationship. Kasi kapag tumaas yung isa, bababa yung isa. At kung bababa yung isa, tataas yung isa. That is called as inverse relationship. How about the mixed costs? Sabi ko kanina, ang mixed cost, ito yung cost na merong variable component at fixed component. In other words, combination siya ng fixed cost at variable costs. The mixed cost per total, anong mangyayari kapag tataas ang activity level or cost driver? Kapag tataas ang activity level or cost driver, tataas ang mixed cost per total. At kung bababa ang activity level or cost driver, bababa din ang mixed cost per total. Kung tataas ang activity level or cost driver, ang mixed cost per unit ay bababa. At kung bababa ang activity level or cost driver, ang mixed cost per unit ay tataas. Kung mapapansin ninyo, yung behavior ng mixed cost per total at mixed cost per unit ay combination ng behavior ng variable cost per total at fixed cost per unit. Tignan ninyo. Yung behavior ng mixed cost per total ay pareho dun sa behavior ng variable cost per total. At yung behavior ng mixed cost per unit ay pareho sa behavior ng fixed cost per unit. That's why sinabi ko kanina na ang mixed cost meron siyang fixed cost component at variable cost component. Now that you know the different cost behavior patterns, it is very important to tell you na merong limitations sa cost behavior patterns. Kasi meron tayong tinatawag na cost behavior assumptions and limitations. We actually have two. The first one is called as relevant range assumption, and the second one is called as time assumption, or otherwise known as time period assumption. The relevant range assumption states that the relevant range refers to the range of activity within which the cost behavior patterns are valid. Any level of activity outside this range may show a different cost behavior pattern. Meaning to say, yung behavior ng variable costs at fixed costs at mixed costs, ganun pa rin as long as within the relevant range. Pero kung beyond or outside the relevant range na, pwedeng magbago yung behavior ng variable cost, fixed costs, at mixed costs. Yun yung ibig sabihin ng relevant range assumption. Under the time assumption or time period assumption naman, the cost behavior patterns identified are true only over a specified period of time. Beyond this, the cost may show a different cost behavior pattern. So parang relevant range assumption lang siya, yun nga lang, ang pinag-uusapan dito is yung specified period of time. Meaning to say, yung behavior ng variable costs, fixed cost, at mixed costs, ganun pa rin as long as pasok siya within the specified period of time. But beyond that specified period of time, pwedeng magbago yung behavior ng variable cost, fixed cost, at mixed cost. Yan yung ibig sabihin ng time period assumption or time assumption. Take note, huwag nyo tong kakalimutan, itong cost behavior assumptions and limitations, kasi magagamit natin yan sa problem solving in the future or in the next topics.